Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. So today's video is, well, I'm not going to be going on a run, but I will obviously be talking about running. And it was sparked by some stuff that I read recently about people obviously thinking that running's a really accessible sport and then getting into running and then realizing that, like, if you want to do well, you got to get these cool trainers. And the dog's down there, by the way. Happy. There you go, there she is. Yeah, so if you want to get into running, you got to get like kind of expensive trainers, and even if you get the cheap ones, then you might be at risk of injury, and then if you get injured, then you've got to pay for physio, and then if you want to get better, then you might be paying for a running coach, and that's super expensive. And race entries, I mean, we all know how expensive race entries are. Even if you go for the smaller ones, they can get really expensive, and they certainly add up. I wanted to do a little bit of a video on ways that you can make running more affordable, whether that is for you or other people that you're trying to convince to get into running in your life. Hopefully some of these resonate with some of you, and hopefully you don't know all of them already, because I do some of these, but a lot of them I also crowdsourced from my Instagram followers who are super savvy when it comes to stuff like this. So God, this dog. I hope you find them useful, and I will get going. So there are 5 separate topics that I want to discuss in today's video, and they are kit, especially trainers, but also watches, things like that, coaching, races, physiotherapy / when you get injured, and then also gels / food. Okay, so starting with kit / trainers, there are lots of different ways that you can get discounted kit, but my favorite thing to do is find kit that works for me and then try it on in store. So like the first trainers that I ever started to wear, I went in, got a gait analysis, managed to figure out which trainers I wanted, and then I went and bought them secondhand. That just meant that they were so much cheaper than actually buying them in the store, and it also meant that I knew that I was buying trainers that actually really worked for me. And the great / not so great thing is that not all trainers work for everyone. So that does mean that people will have bought trainers, maybe miss the returns period, and then they'll try and sell them online. So you do tend to get some pretty good discounts when you try and buy things secondhand. My favorite one is Vinted. It's an app, and I find that most of the stuff is super cheap there. For my UK followers, Rhian is a great option as well. Rhian, it kind of repurposes running kit that people send in and then resells it, and they're super sustainable. I love what they're about, and I think they've got some really good kit there. I've never actually used it myself, but I think they're worth checking out in case you are needing some kit but can't afford or don't want to have to spend the money on getting it brand new, and also, like I say, much more sustainable. If you can't find things secondhand, and obviously if you're buying new kit or new season kit, sometimes it won't already be in the secondhand sites, wait until brands do sample sales or end of season sales, or alternatively, like a lot of the big brands have outlet stores, and that means that you can get stuff like up to 60% off, sometimes even more. I recently went to an outlet store. It's actually where I used to get like all my Nike clothing. Don't buy that anymore. They do everything 60% off, which meant that I could afford shoes and clothes that I wouldn't previously have been able to afford. And so I think that's a really good way of doing it. It still doesn't mean that it's cheap, but it is a lot cheaper than if you're buying at full price. Also, if you have running friends, they might want to be switching around their kit a lot sooner than they necessarily need to, and you can nab that stuff secondhand. I have given some of my kit to a lot of my friends, stuff that I don't wear or use as often as I probably should, and rather than having it just sit in my wardrobe, I like to kind of give it away to people so that they can get the most use out of it as possible. All of those things stand for kit and watches as well, not just trainers. So ultramarathon mandatory kit lists are a big expense. I know that people struggle with when they're first getting into ultras, because you don't necessarily want to be buying all of this stuff if you're doing your first ultramarathon. You don't know if you're going to be doing them again, you don't know if you're going to really enjoy it, so you don't want to have to be forking out on like waterproof trousers, which can cost a hell of a lot of money, and a fancy first aid kit with a foil blanket if you're not actually going to be doing it all over again. One thing that I find quite useful, if you can, is to get in touch with other running friends, people from your running club. If not, Facebook groups are quite useful where you can kind of share kit. I have lent out and also borrowed kit from a lot of people. Like the first time I used poles, for example, I borrowed from a friend because I didn't know if I was actually going to find them useful. So I borrowed them from a friend, absolutely loved them, and then eventually got my own pair. But I didn't want to fork out not actually knowing if I was going to end up using them. Of course, you can get them secondhand, but borrowing from a friend is free and easy, and means that you can test things out before biting the bullet and buying them. Most of the stuff that you need in mandatory kit lists, you might not need more than once a year, if you're doing races once a year, sometimes you won't need it ever again. So borrowing is definitely a great place to start. Okay, so my second point is about coaching. There are loads of great free running programs online, but the problem is they obviously don't take into account your level, ability, your speed, your schedule, none of that kind of stuff. So then if you want to go down the route of getting a coach, that's like 100 quid plus a month, and that's pretty expensive. I am currently using Runner app. It is £16 a month. I mentioned this before. It's definitely not for everyone. If you don't want to spend any money on coaching whatsoever, it's perfectly possible to just coach yourself. But for people first starting out, I know that can be really intimidating. And certainly for me, like, I kind of know how to coach myself, but actually I really like having something or someone holding me accountable. That's where having a coach, even if it's just my phone, comes in handy. That's probably the best replacement coach that I can think of. But of course, if you go online, you find like free plans, you can kind of adapt those to your ability. But when it comes to like scheduling and wanting to get in strength training as well, I haven't found anything better than Runner app. And like I mentioned last time, I do have a discount code for these guys. This isn't an ad for them, but I know so many of you tried it out before and have continued on after your 2-week free trial. So if you use my code Flora, you get a 2-week free trial, and then you can choose whether or not to continue after that point. But I really love it. It's got everything from like couch to 5K to ultra marathons, multi-day ultra marathons, which I'll definitely be using it to train for some of those next year. So that's really exciting and significantly cheaper than getting an actual coach. I don't think really it's a replacement, but it's a good interim alternative if you don't want to or can't fork out 100 quid a month. Okay, so my third point is races. So races can be super expensive, and especially if you're doing them multiple times a year, the cost can really mount up. And annoyingly, like, the price of multi-day events can be so much that it has to be your holiday, but also it might also be like a once in a lifetime experience, which I don't feel like these things should be, you know? If it's your hobby, you should be able to do it more than once in a lifetime. And so that's something that I find quite frustrating. But on the other side, if you're a race organizer, like, these things do cost a lot of money to organize. And with the cost of living crisis, for example, costs for everything are going up, and I think that's what we're seeing in race prices as well. They just get more and more expensive. But there are lots of ways around this, and certainly ways to minimize your spending throughout the year. So I tend to run all my PB road times as time trials rather than as official races. I might not get as good times because of that. You know, I don't have a closed course, I don't have pacers all the time, I don't have anyone else to race against, I don't have the race day atmosphere. But it does mean that I can kind of choose as and when I want to do my races. So for example, I'm currently training for a 10K time trial. There wasn't a 10K local to me that I could do on that particular date within the time frame that I had. So I just decided that I was going to do it as a time trial, and hopefully that works out well for me. Fingers crossed. I'm not entirely sure. I'm slightly nervous about the whole thing, but I will be having a pacer for that just to keep me on track, and mainly also because GPS can be a little bit dodgy. So I just want to make sure that I'm doing everything right, and 2 watches are better than 1. So because I'm doing all my road PBs as time trials, I'm basically kind of halving, or at least cutting out about a third of the races that I do each year. And then the rest of the time I try to enter local races, smaller races. I don't really do big races very often, not lengthwise, but size-wise, you know, the number of people doing them. I think, you know, I don't really like to do races with any more than like 80 people in them, maybe 100 at a push, but like races of 20-30 people are kind of ideal for me. I really enjoy them, and those races tend to be a little bit cheaper, and especially if they're local to you, you know, you're not having to worry about travel, and you're not having to worry about kind of accommodation costs and all that kind of stuff. And the more inaccessible the race, likely the more expensive it is. Local club races are cheaper in general because they're not these big sort of for-profit organizations. So check out your local clubs, see if they host any races, and see if you can join in on those. When I do enter bigger races, and when I have to travel further afield, if I can't get there by train, I try to carpool. Train is obviously very expensive. I have a rail car, which makes it slightly cheaper, but it's still very expensive. And carpooling obviously cuts emissions, and it also means that you're cutting costs massively. So most race organizers will have Facebook pages for their races, and that means you can kind of get in contact with other people who might be doing the race from a similar place to you. It really doesn't take very much organization to be able to carpool to a race, even if it's only like from the nearest station to the race itself, so you avoid having to pay for a taxi. It kind of all helps. They're all ways to cut costs, and it might not get it down to 0, but it will reduce it significantly. Other races, for example, Maverick Race, offer free entry for people who volunteer there. So if you can, definitely get out and help volunteer. I mean, it's a great thing to do for the community. It's a really great great way of meeting people and also has the added benefit of getting you free entry. I am yet to go and volunteer for any of the Maverick races because they're all in the middle of nowhere and I don't actually own a car, but the atmosphere and the people that I meet at the races, it's just all so friendly. I don't know how many other races do this, but I can imagine that it's a lot because it's quite difficult for them to get volunteers, so there are lots of added incentives towards that. On the plus side, also for Maverick race, I think they give you a £60 Adidas voucher if you go and volunteer as well as a free entry, so that also helps point number one about the price of kit. So hopefully some of you guys will go and check out the Maverick races. They happen all over the place throughout the year, so definitely worth checking out. I've done quite a few of their races now and they're always good fun. So for those of you wanting to get a 5k PB, probably my biggest tip for getting a cheap race entry is to do it in parkrun. So obviously you don't have to pay for parkrun at all. If you can find a flat enough one, it's a really good way to kind of simulate that race atmosphere and get a personal best, hopefully. It's not foolproof because you don't know what's going to happen on the day, but I find it's, you know, it's a great atmosphere and it's good fun, and because you've not paid for it as well, there's not so much pressure to get your PB. If you don't get it, you can just go back the next week or 2 weeks later and try again, all for free. Lastly, if you enjoy trail running, I've recently found out that fell running is all not for profit. So fell races are really cheap to enter. So like I recently did a trail race in the Brecon Beacons and it's a for-profit company, really good one by the way, but there was a similar race happening in exactly the same place that was a fell race, and the price for that, even though it was a longer race, was about half the price for the race that I did. They don't, you know, put out loads of advertising, so they can be quite difficult to find, but if you know where to look, you can get really cheap race entries that are really similar to the sort of trail races that I enter and that a lot of us love so much. And fell running is kind of hardcore as well, so if you can get in with that, that's really cool. Okay, so point number 4 is about physiotherapy/injuries. I don't know how helpful this is going to be to all of you, but it is definitely helpful to some of you. Point number 1, obviously, go to the gym. Reducing the risk of injury is so much better than reducing the cost of fixing the injury. If you're getting injured every year or several times a year, the cost really can mount up, speaking from personal experience. But if you can reduce that injury risk to very infrequent, then that's obviously going to be a lot better. Even doing things like home workouts, obviously a gym membership costs money, but even if you do things like home workouts, you can improve your strength and reduce your injury risk. So that's a good place to start. If you are injured, ask your workplace if they have health insurance. So a lot of workplaces will give you some money towards, if you're injured, towards getting like physiotherapy or whatever other specialist sessions you need. Definitely this isn't foolproof, like not all workplaces do this, but a lot of people who followed me on Instagram told me that their workplace did, so there must be a few out there. So it's always worth asking. They said that they wouldn't have known unless they'd asked in the first place. So if your workplace has any sort of like benefits or incentives, it's worth checking with them if you do actually get injured, or maybe in advance so that you know that you can get help as and when you need it. Okay, and last but not least is gels and food/supplements. This shouldn't be expensive, I feel, because like we all need to eat, but at the same time it can get really expensive if you want it to, as with all of these things. There are some really great ways to reduce costs, like just eating real food, like normal food. Personally, I don't eat jelly babies, but I know that a lot of people use jelly babies instead of gels because it's essentially just like glucose, it's just sugar, and they are way cheaper because they're not a specialist item. Also things like bananas, not super lightweight, but still great for when you're on a run, whether that's an ultramarathon or not. During Race to the Tower, I ate peanut butter and jam sandwiches. Threshold Sports they have aid stations around, so it was all like included anyway, but if I'd made myself a PBJ sandwich to go in my backpack, that actually would have been a great idea because it's got protein, it's got carbs, it's got sugar, slow release and fast release, so it's kind of useful for all of that kind of stuff. You can also buy things in bulk, which makes them cheaper. A lot of sites do discounts at the end of season or when things are close to their expiry date. Obviously that's not ideal, you don't necessarily want to be eating things outside of expiry date, but from personal experience it really doesn't matter. I've had a lot of stuff like a year, 2 years beyond expiry date, and it's not mattered one jot. I haven't had any issues with it. Obviously they just got to be super safe with their expiry dates and best before dates, but if you have races coming up and you see a big discount because something expires in a month or whatever and your race is in 6 months, probably don't worry about it. Like, just buy the stuff. and you'll use it. Plus you use it in training, you get through it pretty quickly. It's not just sitting in your drawer for years and years and years. Loads of sites do big discounts and that's a good place to start, but also Real Food can bulk out your training nutrition for a kind of fairly minimal cost. So I think that's it from me for this vlog. I hope that was helpful to you guys. I'd love to hear your cost saving tips down in the comments below, and also what are your biggest expenses? Like when I asked people, most people just said trainers and races. So if you have any ways of making both of those things cheaper, then comment down below, let me know. Let me know also if you did sign up to the runner trial when I mentioned it in my last vlog. I would love to hear if any of you guys are enjoying it. I've got some amazing messages on Instagram from those of you who have done the 2-week trial, absolutely loved it, and kept on with a new training program with the Runner app. I love hearing stuff like that. So if you have done that, definitely let me know in the comments below. Come and check me out over on Instagram as well. I am at Food Fitness Flora, and I will be putting this video into a much more digestible video over on my TikTok as well, which is Flora Beverley. So come and find me on all of those things. That is it for this week's vlog. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up and the subscribe button, and I will see you next week. Bye!